Greetings, traveler. Do multiplayer games really need a single player campaign? Today, we're going to be taking a look at my top 3 reasons why I think this is the case and what happens if you don't do that. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 13 years now. And when we're developing a game, particularly a multiplayer game, the conversation always comes up whether we need a multiplayer campaign or not to be developed at the same time as the multiplayer aspect of the game. So what do I mean by multiplayer games? Think World of Tanks, World of Warships, Crossout, War Thunder, Dreadnought. These kind of games or also Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, the online modes, and so on. So all these games typically have the most of their players engaged in the multiplayer um, matches where there's two or more teams and basically they go at each other until only one team is left alive or there's an objective to achieve and whichever team achieves it first, then that team wins. This is the setting I'm talking about. So in these cases, it's so complicated to make this kind of game. There's so many balance elements to consider, and level design becomes extremely important. It needs to be iterated upon many, many times to get to a good stage. It definitely creates enough work for the developers to say, well, there's so much work we need to do for getting the balance and the multiplayer feeling where it needs to be. If we also need to make a single player campaign on top of that, it's going to be too much work. It's going to extend the scope of the project by so much. We'll need so much extra money to do all that. And besides, nobody plays a single player campaign anyway. So, what I've seen in my experience, at least over the years in game development and playing games myself, is if the multiplayer game can really carry on with its crowd of players, if there is a method for people to stay interested in the game and for new people to break into the game, then perhaps that's a viable strategy. So typically the way this happens is either the game is very simple to understand, so anybody can just pick it up and start playing. There's no particularly difficult mechanic to understand. Usually it's just weapons that just shoot straight. So that doesn't need much explanation because people have a native understanding of it from the real world. Everybody knows what guns generally do. Um, Or the game is slightly more complicated or very complicated, kind of something like Dota or League of Legends or something like that. That has many mechanics, many intricate strategies, and so on. But people usually play with their friends, or usually a friend invites someone to the game, and because those two friends play together, the experienced friend teaches the new player everything they need to know essentially about the game. So any questions that arise about abilities and strategies and so on can be answered by the friend. Now, that leaves the question, well, what happens if you don't have a friend? What happens if you saw this cool game and you just want to try it like a normal player? Um, what's going to happen then? Well, from statistics that I know from certain games, that unfortunately I cannot share which game and what statistics, let's just say that if we're talking about a rather complicated game with deep mechanics and all these wonderful balance considerations, all these different strategies built into the game, that this type of player is good against that type of build and that type of class and that type of vehicle and so on. Games that are more complicated like that, they need the explanation and about what the mechanics are and what all the abilities do and what's good versus what and so on. If players don't get that at the beginning of the game, then there's a super high chance that new players will quit within the first day of trying this game. So there's nothing wrong with the game itself. In fact, the game developers did such a wonderful job putting all the mechanics in the game, making sure they're fun, making sure that the game is fun to play multiple times over. But there's so much effort put into that and maintaining the high level already experienced players of the game that there's absolutely no effort put into bringing new players into the game. And that's fine for a while, I think. But what I've seen happen to many multiplayer games like that is when new players come in and they cannot break into the game, they cannot start enjoying the game, they leave. That leaves just the veterans in the game. The veterans in the game, you know, at some point want an easier experience. They don't want to have all these like super high level, extremely, competitive matches all the time. Sometimes they want to have like an easier time, maybe fight against easier opponents. And these newer players are not around to play with. So all matches end up being, super hardcore, very, very difficult. And there is definitely a place for enjoying a very, very difficult match like that. But if that's the only experience that's available in the match, then that makes it a very specialized experience. So that's not to say it's not fun. But what I've seen historically is that when the game gets to that state where only the super veteran, super hardcore players remain, the population just keeps shrinking. And there's no way for that population to regenerate again, because even if someone invites a new player into that scene, then it's still a very competitive space to navigate. Even if you say, I'll invite a friend and I'll show him the ropes and we'll play together, that friend is still new and he's still playing against all these crazy veterans. So it's tough. It's pretty tough. It needs a lot of hand holding and a lot of luck to make sure that the new player has enough good experiences to actually enjoy playing the game. So that brings us to the reason why I think single player campaigns are beneficial. I think there's three reasons why that's the case. First reason why in such an environment a single player campaign would be beneficial, in my opinion, is um, simply to teach the mechanics. So this sounds very obvious and very simple to say. So simple, perhaps it doesn't need to be said, but you'll be surprised how many games like the ones I mentioned before in this video don't teach the mechanics in any way. They say, here's a player, go play their abilities, or here's a vehicle, go fight other people with it. There is no step in between where you can try to understand what the abilities do. Even if an ability says, does X damage on Y range or whatever, you don't know what that means in the context of the game. You don't know if that's too far or too short, or if it's a lot of damage or too little damage. It just says it does, 500 damage. You're like, is that a lot? Is that too little? Who knows? So first of all, having an environment to just teach the abilities and see like what these abilities do, what all the game mechanics do to begin with, is a huge benefit of a single player campaign. Simply being able to have a few moments to tell the player, listen, this is what this ability does, that's how it functions, this is why it's useful, this is the moments when you should try to use it, and so on. So this is a part where the game teaches the player what's supposed to happen when you use this ability or vehicle or whatever. The second reason why I think single player campaigns are awesome is because after the player has learned these abilities, learned about these abilities rather, so that's the declarative knowledge step done, then we can go over to the procedural knowledge step where you actually use this knowledge yourself to act in the game as the abilities suggest. So if the game says, your third ability is a long range ability, you know that on a conceptual stage, but you have no idea still how that performs when you use it. So in the single player campaign, we can provide the enemies, the environment, the setting, and so on for the player, which is just right for the player to use that ability and see its effects and its usefulness in actual combat or gameplay or whatever the setting is. So having that space where the player can try the ability and hopefully like try it several times, right? It's fine if the player fails the first times when they use the ability and says, okay, I'm supposed to move closer or I'm supposed to use it in this way. The player can make their own adjustments and they have the time to fail and learn the ability and get used to it. That is so vitally important. That, I think, is a single reason why it's so difficult for new players to break into those very competitive multiplayer games. there's just no time to understand um, what abilities they have in their arsenal and how they're supposed to be used and how they're used well. And moreover, when you do join a multiplayer match and let's say some sniper from the other end of the map or some player with a very strong ability simply kills you in one hit, if you don't know what happened, you will think that this game is strange and that you should stop playing it. Now, perhaps not everybody thinks this way, but I certainly do. And I know many other players, winning or losing is not really the point here. The point is understanding what the goal is. So if you know, for example, that if you go too close to that type of class or that type of player, then there's a very high risk of just dying in one hit. Then at least you know that, if you keep your distance and you survive, then the game performs as you understand. And if you found yourself too close to that and that player took advantage of the distance and killed you instantly, you know that, well, that's what's supposed to happen because that's what that player or that class or that vehicle is good at. So you have an innate understanding of what happened, what went wrong, and what you can do next time to do better. That doesn't exist if there is no time to teach the player all the mechanics of the game, or at least the mechanics of their particular class or abilities and so on. So that brings us to the third reason why I think single player campaigns are fantastic. Um, Typically, every game will have its own world, right? It's its own setting. It has something interesting to say about um, its own history and how it's different from all the other games or games of its own type. There is a lot of lore to be taught about the world whenever we see, for example, in games, an art book being released or a developer diary, or in RPGs, there's all these book items that talk about a little bit of the history of the world or the history of a certain character in the game. You see that there's a lot of thought put into that. The developers first created all this lore and thought, well, what would be cool for this world? Or what's special about this sword? Or what's cool about this vehicle? And so on. Everything is so unique in the game and everything is crafted with so much care. I think it's a shame to simply hide that from the players and just say, look, whatever, history there is in the game, forget about all that. Use these swords, beat this guy, or like use these tanks, beat this guy. What's cool about this tank? What battles did it join? Why do we talk about it? Why was it developed? Why didn't we just use one type of tank for everything? Why do we have all these types? And of course, this is not just for tanks. It's for planes, warships, spaceships, airships. Any ship, uh, any ability, any item that's available in the game, anything that gives us our abilities. Being able to expose the player to that story is so beneficial also because once you tell the story of something, that already includes so many traits about the item, right? If you say that this boat um, has these particular features and it was constructed to fill that role, so and so, then without even talking about the abilities and how they function and so on, you can get a general understanding of, is it a tough ship or is it a weak ship? Is it a high attack ship or a low attack ship? Is it a direct attacker or an indirect attacker? Just by knowing history, knowing its history, and knowing its purpose and use and so on, and motivation, the player can already make an image in their mind about what this is supposed to be. So when after that you introduce the abilities, then the abilities make a lot of sense. So if this ship is supposed to be an indirect attacker that's very weak, then you're like, okay, probably it should stay stealthy and it should, I don't know, maybe launch torpedoes from a safe place, or it should function like a submarine or something. Or maybe it should just do reconnaissance for the rest of the team. That sort of understanding is very human. Humans very easily can extract these traits when we hear a story like that. And basically, they do all the heavy lifting for you when you're trying to teach someone something. I think this is a generally really good example of clever game design. This particular piece of advice was shared with me by Inafune Keiji, the creator of Mega Man or Rockman, depending on where you are. So he said, when you make games, try to make things about everyday life things. If you do so, then you don't need to explain them. If you put a supermarket in your game, everybody knows what a supermarket is. And when they see it, they know what expectations to have of it. So if by contrast you put this entirely alien creature that just looks strange in every way and there's no relatable feature on it, then you invoke the feeling of, wonder, mystery, maybe fear, but you certainly don't know what to expect out of it, and you don't know if it's a friend or a foe, or how you're supposed to interact with it. It is inherently so. So if you introduce the player with a very strange new mechanic or something entirely new, or a weird magic item, then you can expect that the player has no idea what to expect from that item and how to interact with it. So when we use a story in a clever way like that and we relate it to real world events or real world items that people are already familiar with, then we save ourselves the work of having to introduce every single detail about that item. And that's why I said in the beginning that if your game simply has pistols, for example, then everybody has a concept of what a pistol is, and you don't need to do too much teaching in the way of how you use it. So that's just an example. So anyway, these are my thoughts of why we would benefit from a single player campaign. It is extra work for the developers for sure, but if you go about it in a clever way, you already have the maps, you already have the abilities, and so on. Developing a multiplayer game is more complicated than developing it for single player from the technical aspect. So adding the single player part shouldn't be too difficult from the network and technical aspect point of view. And giving the player this safe, very relaxed environment to get acquainted with all the skills and all the lore of the world before the player can challenge the multiplayer, in my opinion, makes all the difference in whether the player will understand and enjoy the experience in multiplayer and stick with it, or simply think, I just joined just to die and this is just not fun, and they will quit perhaps on the first day. So, anyway, those are my thoughts on single player campaigns. Thank you so much for your time. And as always, have fun.